A voice on an answering machine, carrying on a full conversation its owner swears he never had. Two teens in a summer camp are pulled into the sky by lights, and a college student preps for an assignment that suddenly vanishes. Was it the assignment that disappeared though, or did they somehow switch to another reality? These are more mysterious times people claim to visit a parallel world and came back changed. From Reddit user Flamingo comes an unsettling experience with an answering machine. Goes as follows. This happened about 15 years ago. I called my friend up and he wasn't home, so I left a message on his answering machine. I said, "Hey, it's me, kill all extremists. Sorry, I missed you. Call you later. Bye," and then hung up and left the house. I made no other calls. Later that day, he calls me back and he says, "Wow, that was quite a message you left. Who was that girl you were talking to?" I was like, "What are you talking about? I wasn't talking to any girl." Well, as it turns out, the message didn't end after I said bye. I had to go over to his house and listen to this message a few times. After my initial message that I did leave, there was a slight pause, and then it continues on for another 30 to 40 seconds or so, with me talking to some girl. It was my voice, but a conversation I never had with a girl whose voice I did not recognize. You could compare it to the message I know I did leave. The two voices were indistinguishable. Not just the voice, but the talking mannerisms. It was my voice. Also, references to my occupation and activities were the same. Basically, in this conversation, I was talking to this girl about going skiing, but I had to go down to my shop and work on a car first, which totally correlated to me. Then the message just stopped. It was recorded on one of those digital answering machines that records the message to a chip, so there was no tape I could have taken and analyzed, unfortunately. Also, I nor my friend had party lines, so that's not an explanation. It was very freaky. I can't explain it. Back in the summer of 1968, two teenagers working at a summer camp in Vermont, 16-year-old Michael Lapp and 19-year-old Janet Carnell, were just hanging out by the dock, watching the sun set over Lake Champlain. Most of the camp was empty because the kids were away at a swim meet. Pretty peaceful scene, but it didn't last. Michael spotted a weird light in the sky. At first he figured it was just a star, but then it suddenly dropped and started coming toward them. Soon, three smaller lights broke off from the main glow and started zigzagging over the water in ways no plane or helicopter could. The lights got closer, formed a triangle, and then one dove straight into the lake. Michael described the sound that followed like a, quote, 1,000 tuning forks, which is such an oddly specific comparison to make. Then he noticed a transparent dome on the craft, and inside were what he described as two childlike creatures with big heads, long necks, and huge eyes. The craft shot a beam at them, so Michael grabbed Janet and pulled her down as they felt themselves begin floating into the air. The next thing they knew, they were back sitting on the dock. But it was much later. Both were disoriented, and Janet seemed almost in a trance. Years later, Michael started having recurring nightmares, always about being taken. He recalled being inside the ship, seeing Janet examined, looking up through the dome at Earth and the stars. Janet later recalled the event, describing it almost exactly as Michael had, only she hadn't spoken to him in years. Researcher Walter Webb eventually concluded that the two had, quote, no opportunity for collusion, and that they'd experienced a, quote, real external event of unknown origin. Reddit user MissPack01 had a very odd experience with a school assignment. They write, "I'm going to college in British Columbia, Canada, and I'm taking a business class. So first week of February, our teacher talks about an assignment that'll be due March 2nd. It's a 3-page paper with references on something we've learned in the class. That night he posts a little thing about due date and expectation and formatting, blah blah blah. I start the paper early to get it out of the way, but of course, life and work get in the way, so I forget about it for a week. Fast forward to yesterday's class and I start freaking out about the assignment. I go to my folder on the computer and it's not there for some reason. Oh no, maybe I forgot to save. Unlikely, but possibly. So when I get to class, I ask him if he wants it submitted online, because I didn't see a Dropbox, or handed in physically on Monday. Here's where it gets weird. He doesn't have a clue what I'm talking about. Says there never was any assignment. I got him to look on the course site where he posted the outline and nothing was there. I asked a couple classmates and nobody had a clue what I was talking about either. This is so weird. I'm only taking 2 classes as I work full time, so no, I did not get the assignment mixed with another class. In the last month, Did I somehow walk through a door to another universe? Well, I can't tell you for sure, Redditor, but if I switched to a parallel universe that meant everything stayed normal, but I no longer had homework due, I would count that as a win. This one comes from a Redditor named Carla Ray 14, and if the title of the post, "I'm convinced my parallel universe self was speaking to my family," doesn't creep you out already, then just listen to this. So about 5 years before she made the post, Carla's parents and 2 sisters were traveling around Europe. She stayed home with her husband and their baby. Well, one night at 3 a.m. her phone starts ringing. It's her dad. She ignores it at first, thinking maybe he forgot about the time difference, but then it rings again and again. When she finally checks her phone, she sees a dozen missed calls and a pile of messages from her family, all saying things like, "Everything will be okay, we're going to get the next flight home to be with you, stay strong, we love you." Completely freaked out, she answers the next call and demands to know what's going on. Her dad, sounding really shaken, tells her, "I've just been on the phone with you for an hour. What do you mean, what's going on?" He insists that she called him in tears, saying her husband left her after she told him she was pregnant. Carla's husband was literally asleep beside her though. She says, "Dad, what are you talking about? He's right here. He hasn't walked out on me, and I'm definitely not pregnant." Her family swore it was her voice on the line though. Even her sister said she talked with Carla during the call, heard a friend in the background, and got details like Carla canceling her dentist appointment. Something that was actually true, but only her husband knew about. Carla had to send a photo of her and her husband right then and there to prove that nothing happened. To this day, her dad just shakes his head and says, "I don't know what to believe." Is it possible someone was just making a prank call? I mean, I guess maybe, but they guessed a lot of specific details if that's the case. Is it also possible that some version of Carla from a parallel universe managed to call her dad in this one? I don't know. What do you guys think? From a now deleted Reddit user comes an odd encounter at a gas station. Back in 2016, I was driving home late at night after visiting a friend. It was a route I knew well, just a long stretch of highway with barely any traffic at that hour. About halfway home, I noticed a gas station up ahead. The thing is, I didn't remember ever seeing one there before. It didn't look new either, it looked old, like straight out of the 80s. Flickering neon lights, a beat up old truck parked out front. It even had an old school gas pump. Well, I needed gas anyway, so I pulled in. Plus, there was just no way I wasn't checking this place out. The moment I stepped out of my car, everything felt off. Inside, there was an old man behind the counter staring at a tiny TV. I asked if they took cards, but he just shook his head. Cash only. I didn't have cash, so I turned around to leave. As soon as I made it back to my car, it struck me just how weird this situation was. An old gas station that I'd never seen before along a stretch of road I'd driven down plenty of times that apparently only took cash. I shuddered a little and then drove home and tried not to think about the experience before writing it down today. Honestly, I still don't know where I stopped that night or maybe even when. In 1975, Travis Walton and his logging crew were driving home after a long day working in the Apache Site-Greaves National Forest when they spotted something very bizarre. A glowing red light hovering over the trees. As they got closer, they saw what looked like a metallic craft suspended in midair. Most people would hit the gas and get out of there, but Walton had other ideas. Ignoring his crew's warnings, he got out of the truck and walked toward it. And that's when a beam of light shot down from the craft, knocking him off his feet, lifting him into the air. That was enough for the rest of the crew. They panicked and sped off. Guilt quickly set in though, and they decided to turn back. But when they returned a few minutes later, Walton was gone. A massive search followed, but no sign of Walton turned up for 5 days. Suddenly though, he reappeared. Confused and disoriented, he ended up telling everyone eventually that he'd been taken aboard a UFO, where he encountered strange beings that seemed to be experimenting on him. He claimed he managed to fight them off and escape deeper into the ship before waking up on the side of the road with no idea how much time had passed. The case became one of the most well-documented alien abduction stories in history, probably, especially since Walton and his crew all passed multiple polygraph tests. This next case, often referred to as the friendship case, might not fit the typical missing person story. but it's got a weird, unsettling angle that connects to the idea of people vanishing, at least temporarily, and coming back with some pretty wild stories. It's not going to go where you think it's going to go. So during a stretch of time between the 1950s and 60s, a group of people in Italy claimed that they were regularly in contact with extraterrestrial beings. They were supposedly peaceful, highly advanced, and deeply invested in guiding humanity toward a better future. According to those involved, the aliens would take them to hidden bases on Earth, sharing advanced knowledge about science and spirituality, and the importance of unity. Some claim to have spent significant time with these beings, and as if this whole thing wasn't strange enough, some believe that in the course of these interactions, a few of the humans may have gotten a little too close to their extraterrestrial friends, possibly leading to the birth of alien-human hybrids. Now, obviously, this is a pretty nutty case, no pun intended, but if this story is to be believed, we've got a situation where ordinary people vanished, at least for short periods, and were taken to who knows where. Apparently, though, they came back changed. This next story comes from another now deleted Reddit user and goes as follows. In 2019, I went on a solo hiking trip in Washington. It was a well-traveled trail, nothing dangerous. I planned to camp overnight and head back the next morning. Around 1 p.m., I set up camp in a clearing, and that's when things got weird. I noticed that the forest was silent. There were no birds to be heard, no wind, just this heavy stillness. The sky had also changed. It wasn't dark, but the light had this washed out grayish tint. I was uneasy at this point, but decided it just wasn't enough to get too freaked out about. Maybe a storm was coming. Well, then about an hour later, I heard the voices, muffled like a bad recording of human speech. I stuck my head out of my tent expecting to see someone, but the clearing was empty. Now, I must have fallen asleep soon after this because I don't remember much after that. But when I woke up, the clearing looked different. The trees seemed taller, the air was heavy. At this point, I was just freaked out and decided it was time to head home. Thing is, the trail was missing. At least I couldn't find it. I walked for hours in the direction I'd come, but I never seemed to get anywhere. It was actually getting dark now. Finally, I made it out though and reached my car. I checked the time, and that's when I lost it. Less than 2 hours had passed. This was impossible. I could have sworn I was out there for 5 hours. Well, I haven't gone down that trail since, and I never will again. In August of 1976, 4 friends set out for a camping trip in the Allagash Wilderness in Maine, hoping for some peaceful time away. But things took a strange turn when they spotted a bright light in the sky on their second night, which then quickly disappeared. 2 nights later, the same light appeared again, only this time it was much more intense. In fact, they described it looking almost like the sun. As they watched, it followed them along the water. One of the men, Charlie, tried to signal SOS using his flashlight, and that's when the light shot a beam toward him. When they returned to camp, everything felt off. The fire they'd left burning was out, and they were completely drained as if hours had passed. Days went by without any other strange sightings, but when the men got home, they began having these unsettling dreams, all of them similar and terrifying. It wasn't until 1988 that they finally sought help from UFO researcher Ray Fowler and decided to undergo hypnosis. Under hypnosis, they all recalled being abducted by aliens, terrifying creatures who performed medical exams on them and even took their skin and bodily fluids. What was most chilling was that each of their stories matched almost perfectly, and they even passed polygraph tests.
Friedrich Valentich was an experienced pilot living in Australia. On the morning of October 21st, 1978, he embarked on a solo flight from Moorabbin, Victoria, Australia to a nearby island, Kings Island. In total, the flight should have taken no more than an hour, and the weather was pretty pristine, so it should have been a fairly easy flight as well. No clouds, little wind, beautiful day. The journey started out pretty mundane, but partway through, Friedrich radioed into air traffic control, and he informed the men on the ground that there was an aircraft tailing him, to which ground control replied, "There are no other aircrafts in this area." But Friedrich insisted that someone or something was hot on his trail. A little while later, he informed them that the aircraft was no longer behind him, but actually hovering above his plane, and a short while after that, he radioed in for the very last time, to say something along the lines of, "It's on top of me again, and it's not an aircraft." His final message was followed by 17 seconds of radio silence, and then some horrible metallic screeching noise. After that, nothing. Friedrich Valentich was never heard from again, and neither his remains nor the remains of his aircraft were ever found. While many people attribute Friedrich's disappearance to the presence of a UFO, many others believe that it's entirely possible he was sucked into a wormhole that carried him into a different version of reality, where he made it to Kings Island and all is well.
In 1978, Stephen Kubacki, a 23-year-old student from Michigan, went skiing in the countryside. He was a seasoned skier, so it was unusual when he went missing. His friends reported him missing after he failed to return, and search teams were sent out, but there was just no sign of him. After more than a year, 15 months exactly, he was suddenly found, though, 700 miles away in Pennsylvania without any memory of where he'd been. What's really strange is that Stephen Kubacki couldn't remember anything about his disappearance. He was found in a place he had never been before, and he had no idea how he got there. He was also in surprisingly good health despite being missing for over a year. Kubacki described a sense of having been in a different world or place, but he couldn't provide any clear details at the time. His story was incredibly strange because he had no visible signs of injury or distress, and the weather conditions had been relatively mild during his absence. So just what the hell happened?
This next story comes from Reddit, and it goes like this. One night, my friends, we'll call them E, C, W, and K, were at the gas station. K got out of the car and went inside to buy some stuff. About 7 minutes later, E and I are sitting in the front seat, and we see K walk out and come right up to the car. But as soon as he's about to open the door, he disappears into thin air. We had a clear view of the store entrance and everything else around us. I didn't think that E saw the same thing I did until E turned to me very confused, asking if K just came out of the store or am I crazy? And I said, "No, you're not crazy. I saw him come out too." My other two friends, W and C, said they weren't even paying attention. But about 5 minutes later, K came out of the store, and as soon as K got in the car, I asked him if he had already come out of the store, but he said no, he'd been in there the entire time. So basically, this guy's saying that his friend disappeared and then reappeared moments later in a different location. I'm not sure if this is a case of cross realities or a time glitch, but either way, super spooky.
The case of Brian Schaefer has to be one of the strangest missing persons cases in recent history, or even all of history, really, seeing as there's so much video evidence and yet no definitive answers. A medical student from Ohio named Brian Schaefer disappeared in 2006 while at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona with friends near his campus. Security footage from the bar showed Brian chatting with a couple of women outside just before 2 a.m. before entering the building, and that's the last piece of security footage there is of him. Brian Schaefer was never seen again. The footage clearly shows him walking into the bar. There's just no footage of him leaving it, even though the cameras should have captured his exit. This has led to all sorts of theories, of course. Some people think he might have been abducted or that he found a way out that wasn't captured by the cameras, but in that case, where would he have gone? Had he possibly been involved in a crime of some sort or secret activity that led to his disappearance? Well, possibly, but there's never been any solid evidence of that. It's like he just slipped into a wormhole or something.
This next story also comes from Reddit, and it goes as follows. About 6 months ago, I'm sitting in the living room of our tri-level house, and I see my roommate walk up from the basement, turn the corner, and walk down the hallway to his bedroom. Haas, our American bulldog, is following him. I needed to tell my roommate something, and so I got up and followed Haas, who was following my roommate down the hallway. Me and the dog get to my roommate's bedroom. I turn the corner into his room, and he isn't in there. And the dog is looking up at me with the same confused look on his face. At this moment, I turn around to go back downstairs, and here comes my roommate, walking up from the basement in the exact same manner, fashion, whatever that I had just witnessed. And then Haas, the dog, starts barking at him. The user goes on to say that normally he would attribute this kind of crazy thing to sleep deprivation, but that the dog's reaction just made it feel so real. Like the other Reddit story, it's up for debate as to whether or not this is a time glitch or a crossover of realities. Also, like the other Reddit story, super weird. I would probably be questioning my reality a little bit if this happened to me.
Amelia Earhart's disappearance is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of all time. In 1937, she set off on a mission to become the first woman to fly around the world. But on July 2nd, her plane vanished somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. The last radio transmission from her reported she was running low on fuel near Howland Island, and then nothing. The massive search that followed turned up nothing, and Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea. That's the official story, but over the years, people have reported strange sightings and theories that suggest she might not have died in a crash. Some claim she was captured by the Japanese and held as a prisoner of war. Others believe she assumed a new identity and lived out her days in secrecy. Some claim to have actually spotted her with their own eyes. And in 2017, a supposed long-lost photograph surfaced from US military archives and was shared online. Some said there was a woman looking a lot like Earhart and a man who could be Noonan on a dock in the Marshall Islands. In Sydney, Australia, in 1987, Gabriel Nagy went out to run errands like any normal day. He even called his wife Pamela, saying that he'd be home for lunch, but he never showed up. Pamela called the police, and soon after, a disturbing discovery was made. Gabriel's car was found burned out on the side of the road, and there was no sign of Gabriel himself. There was a massive search, but the case quickly went cold. That is, until 2 weeks later, when police discovered someone had withdrawn money from Gabriel's account over 100 miles away. But after that, the trail went dead again for 20 years. Right before Gabriel was about to be declared legally dead, one final search by a determined constable led to a shocking discovery. A man in Mackay had recently undergone surgery. His name was Ron Saunders, but hospital records showed that he also went by Gabriel Nagy. When authorities contacted him, he told them that he had barely remembered the last 2 decades. He'd been living on the streets, doing odd jobs with only fragments of memory from his past life. Doctors suspected that he'd suffered severe head trauma in the accident that burned out his car, leading to a rare case of amnesia. But something didn't quite add up. If he still knew his name, why hadn't he tried to find his family? Why not contact the police? Well, whatever the answer, the family was reunited in the end. What would you do if you realized your work could be used for something catastrophic? In the case of Italian physicist Ettore Majorana, he might have chosen to vanish. In 1938, Majorana, a brilliant scientist working on cutting-edge atomic research, boarded a ship from Palermo to Naples, but when the ship arrived, he was nowhere to be found. Witnesses confirmed that he'd gotten on the boat, but no one saw him get off. There were no reports of foul play either, and the weather had been calm. For years, people wondered if he'd been kidnapped, killed, fled into hiding. It wasn't until 2011 that a new clue finally came about. A photograph taken in Argentina in the 50s of a man who looked exactly like Majorana. Facial recognition experts found 10 points of similarity, meaning it was very likely him, but he barely looked like he'd aged. The leading theory is that Majorana, realizing his work on neutrinos could be used for nuclear weapons, deliberately disappeared. Some believe he may have even worked on early atomic research before realizing the implications and choosing to disappear and start over. But to this day, we still can't say for sure. On May 25th, 1985, police in Aurora, Colorado were called to a shopping mall about a woman in distress. She had no ID, no memory of who she was, and was carrying only an empty notepad and a car key. She was taken to a hospital where she spent 4 months trying to piece together her past, even reaching out to local news outlets for help, but nothing turned up. With no answers, she decided to start fresh. She changed her name to Jane D and moved to Alaska, where she built a whole new life, marrying, having 2 sets of twins, and settling down. 12 years passed, And that's when a co-worker of hers happened to see a news broadcast from Seattle about a missing woman named Jody Roberts. The photo was unmistakable. Jane D was Jody Roberts, an investigative journalist who had disappeared from Washington State in 1985. But what happened? How had she completely forgotten who she was? Long-term amnesia this severe is usually caused by extreme trauma or an epileptic event. Roberts had no history of epilepsy, and before vanishing, she'd emptied her bank account and taken her cats to a shelter. It looked like she'd planned to disappear, but to this day, the truth's never come out. She still goes by Jane D and is intensely private of person, not interested in speaking to the press. She has no social media. Does make you wonder though, if something happened, something to do with her journalism job that made her feel the need to get away. A man named Russ Kellett from North Yorkshire, England, came out with some pretty wild claims a few years back, and when various news sites told his story online, some people just memed the hell out of him, others were absolutely giddy. The story is pretty insane, but it is also pretty entertaining, and I'll just say, I'd love it to be real. So Kellett says that he's been taken by aliens at least 60 times. That's 60. Starting when he was just a boy. He describes waking up in a strange tunnel-like space, then finding himself on an operating table surrounded by towering Dracula-like beings who pumped a mysterious liquid into his body, supposedly turning him into a super soldier. For over 30 years, Kellett insists he's been part of an alien military force fighting against a race known as the Dragos, massive reptilian creatures with dragon-like heads. He says time moves differently in this war, with 4 hours on Earth equaling 4 years on distant planets, and that he's been battling not just in space, but here on Earth too, in places like the UK, other parts of Europe and South America. He even claims to have been transported through time, using a strange glass sphere inside a room with a chessboard patterned floor, sent to fight in conflicts across the universe. And I will just leave it at that. A TikToker named Kilmaru started uploading videos over 2 years ago, with his first video captioned, "I am very scared." In it, he's filming from his hotel window, looking out at a city street in broad daylight, and there's no one there. Then he walks outside. Restaurants, supermarkets, even a McDonald's, all stocked like normal, but it's completely silent. Since then, he's posted hundreds of videos from places that are normally crammed with tourists: the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the streets of London, amusement parks, the New York City subway, all empty. He claims that he slipped into another dimension, an eerily empty alternate reality version of Earth. His followers throw him challenges, telling him to visit specific spots to prove he's really alone, but every time, it's just him on camera. One of the craziest updates came when someone told him to go to Berlin airport to try and escape. He says he fell asleep in the lounge, then woke up on a massive ship at sea. For 6 days he explored it before jumping into a lifeboat and making it back to land. And just like that, he was back to wandering through a perfectly normal looking world where he's apparently the only person alive. Now, of course, I don't know whether you believe in the alternate reality thing or not, but it is impressive that he's managed to film so many iconic locations with no one else in frame. I don't know if he just happens to find super specific times, maybe there's some editing trickery going on, but I think this is an interesting little art project aside from the mystery. Reddit user 17DemonDickS's shared a creepy story with the heading, "I think I stepped into a parallel universe for a moment." They were about 18 or 19 at the time, still living in their childhood home. It was summer, early afternoon, and they were heading out for one of their usual walks to a nearby park, something they'd done almost every day for years. They slipped on their shoes, opened the front door, and stepped outside, and instantly knew that something was off. Nothing looked different. The ravine next to the house, the tree in the yard, the driveway, the neighbors' homes, everything was exactly where it should be, but everything just felt inexplicably wrong. The Redditor said it was like reality itself had shifted in some subtle but deeply unsettling way. They stood there for a moment trying to shake off the feeling before heading down the driveway. About halfway down, they spotted their neighbor across the street tending to his garden. The neighbor looked up, froze. His face went completely pale like he'd just seen a ghost. The neighbor slowly opened his mouth about to say something with this look of terror on his face, but before the Redditor could respond, they were back inside the house, standing at the front door again, hand on the handle, about to step out. This time though, when they opened the door, the neighborhood felt completely normal again. The neighbor wasn't even outside anymore. Demon D's decided to skip the walk that day. Years later, they still can't explain the feeling. The thing that bothers them the most isn't even the sudden teleportation or the neighbor's terrified expression. It was indescribable wrongness, like they were looking at a completely different version of their own street. Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were English academics who, in August of 1901, took a trip to the Palace of Versailles in France. After touring the main palace, they decided to walk through the gardens where Marie Antoinette used to hang out. They got lost and missed the turn from the main avenue, ending up on a quiet lane. Moberly noticed a woman shaking a white cloth out of the window, while Jourdain saw an old deserted farmhouse with a plow outside. That's when they started to notice this heavy, oppressive feeling wash over them. Moberly later described it as if, quote, everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant. Even the trees seemed to become flat and lifeless, like wood worked in tapestry, end quote. Then they came across two men who looked like gardeners but wore long coats and three-cornered hats, very old-timey clothing, even for 1901. Close by, a man sat near a garden kiosk, his face covered in smallpox. As they finally crossed a bridge into the gardens, Moberly spotted a woman sketching on the grass. The lady wore a light summer dress and a white hat. Her hair was old-fashioned. Moberly thought she was a tourist at first, but later became convinced that what they'd both seen was Marie Antoinette herself. Neither mentioned what happened for a week, but after comparing notes and researching some of the history of the place, they believed they had somehow stepped back to August 10th of 1792, just weeks before the French monarchy was overthrown. The story blew up when they published it in 1911 under fake names in their book, An Adventure. Years later, they found an old map that showed the bridge they said they crossed, and that bridge wasn't on any newer maps, cause it no longer existed. It hadn't for a long time. To this day, this is still one of the most famous and well-documented time-slip stories in existence. Reddit user Albert Norman 2069 shared a wild story about what he thinks was a brief trip into an alternate timeline. He says it happened on June 28th, 2014. His day started normally, waking up, brushing his teeth, eating breakfast, and getting in the car for work. But when he switched on the radio, things suddenly got strange. Instead of his usual music station, there was a news talk show playing. The host was talking about a recent victory in the Great War, praising troops in the military. At first, Albert figured it was just about the ongoing withdrawal from Afghanistan, but then the host started talking about the victory in Italy and how this win would finally end a second Great Depression. He was kind of confused, but figured it was just a radio play or something, so he just kind of brushed it all off. This wasn't the last he'd heard of this, though. Later during lunch, Albert overheard coworkers chatting about that same victory in Italy and something about preserving unity. They also kept repeating the numbers 33-13. Finally, he was like, all right, what's going on here? So he asked, what the hell they were talking about, and they looked at him all offended and basically told him that his question was disrespectful to the troops. That's when Albert noticed a coworker named Sam was missing. But disturbingly, when he asked about him, nobody seemed to know who Sam was at all. On his way home, Albert took a different route through the city and things just got more unsettling. He noticed there were these banners celebrating the victory, showing Marines landing on a foreign beach. The city also looked way poorer than he remembered. There were abandoned storefronts. Some buildings actually looked like they were crumbling. At home, he turned on CNN and the anchors were discussing how American forces had defeated Italian logistical targets with minimal civilian casualties, how insurgencies in Greece and Ireland were winding down. At this point, Albert was kind of getting terrified. He had no idea what was going on. Was he losing his mind? Was this a bad dream? Well, he did what anyone would do. He went straight to Wikipedia. That's when he found a detailed page about a war he'd never heard of. This one comes out of Berkshire County, Massachusetts, back in September 1st of 1969. That night, dozens of people claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky over Sheffield. Some described them as being attached to a disc-shaped craft, and even stranger, a lot of witnesses said they couldn't account for chunks of time after watching it. It wasn't just like, I saw lights and went home. People felt like something really happened to them. One of the most talked about witnesses is Thomas Reed. He was only 9 at the time, riding in a car with his mom, brother, and grandmother. He said they first saw glowing orbs shoot out from the trees along the road. When they got near the Sheffield Bridge, things got even weirder. It came to a stop off the right side of the road. Everything got really calm. It was like being in the middle of a hurricane. There was like a barometric change in pressure. It was just like a dead silence. Then there was an eruption of crickets and frogs, and it got really loud, and that was it, end quote. Next thing they knew, they were back in the car, but 2 hours had passed. His mom and grandmother had even switched seats, and no one could explain how. Reed later said they regained flashes of memory about being inside some massive hangar with curved hallways, and other people were there too. As for where they were, who the hell knows? This next story was shared by a now deleted Reddit user and goes as follows. Okay, I don't really know how to explain this without sounding insane, but I've been thinking about it for years and I still can't make sense of it. Back in 2016, I was driving home from my job around 2 a.m. I live in a small town, so the roads are usually dead quiet at that time. There's one stretch of highway I always take that goes past a gas station, then about a 15-minute straight before I hit my exit. Well, this time though, something was off. I passed the gas station like usual, but when I looked at the digital clock in my car, it said 2:17. I swear it had been 2:04 the last time I checked. Right as I passed the station, that stretch of road normally takes 15 minutes, but somehow it felt like it just skipped. I don't remember zoning out, I don't remember seeing anything weird. It was just like the time jumped forward and I was closer to home than I should have been. The creepier part is the gas station itself. For a couple months after that, whenever I drove by it, the lights were off. The pumps were wrapped in yellow tape and the sign was taken down. When I asked a coworker about it, they told me that gas station has been shut down for years, but I know I stopped there plenty of times and I definitely remember seeing it open that night. I don't have proof, I know it sounds like bad memory or whatever, but I can't shake the feeling that I've somehow crossed into a place where things aren't exactly the same. On October 11th, 1973, two guys from Mississippi, Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson, went out night fishing in the Pascagoula River. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, but then Parker noticed blue lights hitting the water. At first he figured it was the cops telling them to pack it up, but what came next was nothing close to that. A big light came out of the clouds. Parker later said it was a blinding light. It was hard to tell with the lights so bright, but it looked like it was shaped like a football, about 80 foot. It made a very loud sound. It was just a hissing noise, end quote. Then three strange floating creatures came out of the craft. They didn't have legs, and Parker said they had mitten-shaped claws. One was gray and didn't have a neck. Another looked more feminine. When one of them reached for Parker, instead of panicking, he suddenly felt calm. I think they injected us with something to calm us. I was kind of numb and went along with the program, he said. Both men claimed they were pulled aboard the craft and examined. Hickson remembered. There were no seats, no chain. They just moved me around and I couldn't resist them. I just floated, felt no sensation, no pain. He also described a giant eye-like machine scanning them. He reported everything to the sheriff that night, and deputies secretly recorded them afterward, expecting them to slip up. Instead, they caught the men whispering in fear. Jesus Christ, God have mercy, they had us. They could have done anything to us, Hickson said. For decades, Parker stayed mostly quiet, only writing a book in 2018 after Hickson's death, and that's when other locals came forward saying they saw something strange in the sky that very same night. In 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas-Boas claimed he was abducted by aliens. Working late in his fields to avoid the heat, he said he saw a red star approaching, which turned out to be an egg-shaped craft with a rotating red light. Boas alleged that 5-foot-tall beings in gray overalls and helmets captured him and took him aboard, where he was subjected to blood tests and a strange gas that made him violently ill. He also claimed a female alien engaged with him intimately and indicated she would raise their child in space. 4 hours later, he was released and watched as the craft just flew back up into the sky. A lot of people obviously dismissed his story, but a man named Dr. Olavo Fontes noted Boas had burns, bruising, and nausea. Boas later became a lawyer, but he never shook this incident. He'd often craft models of the UFO he claimed to have seen, and he stuck to his story till his death in 1991. The first story comes to us from Reddit user SadBlackCat666, who tells of the time they were introduced to their deceased great aunt. My maternal grandfather's sister passed away from cardiac issues in 2000. I was born in 2003 and was told for years growing up that this is your aunt, we'll just call her Laura here. She died from heart issues. I was able to understand the concept of death, dying from a very young age. So I understood that she passed away and that I would never meet her. Fast forward to 2014 or 15, I'm at a family function and my mom introduces me to my aunt. She explained to me, this is your Aunt Laura. I was shocked and told them both that I thought she died before I was born. She looked exactly like the woman in the pictures I was shown as a kid, so I knew it was her. They were both confused. After a bit of talking, I went back to hanging out with my cousins. However, the whole thing still spooked me for years to come. When I was 18, I asked my mom if she remembered this incident. She had no clue what I was talking about and still has no clue. She just doesn't remember a damn thing about what happened. I'm in my early 20s now and I'm still confused about the whole ordeal. I sometimes wonder if I slipped into a parallel universe where my great aunt was still alive in the mid-2010s. Striped Macaron posted about her incredibly harrowing near-death experience on Reddit. She'd been 25 years old at the time, driving home from work one night in Los Angeles on a curvy section of road on Sunset Boulevard. Suddenly a car spun out of control in front of her, blocking her lane with no time to halt. With another car beside her, options were limited. She instinctively swerved right then left to avoid collision. Then she felt a surreal flashback to a trip she'd taken with her mother to Disney World. She'd only remembered vague parts of the trip, but this particular memory wasn't one of them. This is when she was convinced her life was flashing before her eyes and that she was going to die. She screamed, "No, this isn't fair. Not yet," as she swerved all over Sunset Boulevard. But then she just stopped and suddenly found herself alone on the road, as if everything had been wiped clean. She drove back home and didn't see a single car the entire way. Sunset Boulevard on a Saturday night was eerily deserted. She reached home and parked the car, still no one in sight. Once inside, she called a friend asking her to confirm that she really was alive, just to ground herself back into reality. She was convinced she might be in a limbo state after death. She finishes by saying, "There was no way mathematically to escape it. There was nowhere for the car on the right to go. This moment has haunted me my whole life. There have been times when I have questioned my own existence. I've wondered if my life since has been a very detailed death trip and I'm actually lying on Sunset Boulevard." The next story comes from Reddit user Cold Old Duck. I was picking up my mom and driving towards the same intersection I always went through. Lights were green. All of a sudden in my head, I felt and heard a split second of pure dread. Someone running the red and hitting me broadside right in the driver's side door. I could feel the crash, being crushed, the pain, the blackness, and it was instantly gone, just left with the dread and terror. I braked hard and slowed to an almost crawl stop at the intersection despite the green light, and a car came flying through the red at high speed a second or two later. Never knew why or how I knew, but it was terrifying. I felt like a cat who had escaped with one life less. Reddit user MaterialWolf8005 brings us this next story entitled, "I died and woke up in a parallel universe." I have sleep apnea, and sometimes if I sleep facing up, I will wake up gasping for air and choking on my saliva. Anyway, I was so tired I slept facing up. I remember waking up freaking out and gasping for air. As I looked to the ceiling, my vision started going black from all angles into a single point. Think of how an old TV turns off. After that, I was staring at myself through a mirror I have facing my bed. I remember thinking, "Oh no, I'm dead," as I looked at myself lying down. Then I saw myself moving as if I was waking up. I woke up. But the craziest part is that as soon as I woke up, I saw myself in the mirror staring at me, but standing up, not laying down. Now this world feels off. I was anxious and depressed, and all of a sudden, I'm fine. I feel like I died in a parallel universe and woke up in this one. It's so weird. I can't explain it, but I feel different. This next story is pretty trippy. It comes from Peyton Lay 0616, who seemed to have watched a monster truck completely vanish right in front of their house. They write, "This happened not too long ago. I was standing on my porch watching my kids play in the front yard. Our street has a crossroad intersection at the end, and I could see it from where I was. As I was watching my two kids, I noticed a big black truck, the kind that has floodlights at the top and bars in front of the grill, pulling up to the intersection from the left road. I saw a bald man driving and two other guys in the bed of the truck, and on the sides were two different flags. One looked like a French flag, I believe, and the other I had never seen before. They looked like they were celebrating, and I remember wondering if maybe their team had won a soccer game or something, because it looked like they were being loud. But the thing was absolutely silent, and I could see them whooping and hollering and chanting. Anyway, they turned down my street, coming towards me. I kept my eyes on them because they were intriguing me. I watched them turn down my street, start coming my way. Now, here's the tricky part. My neighbor had a big SUV in their driveway that blocked off my vision from part of the road, and once that truck, those two flags, and three celebrating men reached the part of the road obstructed by my view of the SUV, they never came back out. I even walked down into my yard to see if maybe they'd pulled into the grass of another neighboring house, but nothing. They just vanished behind the neighbor's car. Always awkward running into someone who recognizes you and you just can't remember their name, or worse, can't remember them at all. This story from Open Temperature 6440 kind of takes that to a different level. It goes as follows. This happened back in 2014. I went to Walgreens a few blocks from my house at night to buy a few items. While I was there, this guy down the aisle from me started talking to me like he knew me, but I didn't know him. Never seen him before in my life. He asked me how things are going and asked if I was still working for Joe. Joe was the name of my boss that I worked for a while when I was in college. I told him no, I wasn't still working for Joe because I'd graduated and gotten a full-time job. I was so confused and asked how he knew me. He seemed surprised that I didn't remember him and said that he was Joe's son, which is weird because the Joe I worked for didn't have a son, just two daughters. He could tell I was confused and asked if I was okay, and I replied that I was fine, but I didn't remember him. He was still shocked that I didn't know him. Eventually, the conversation ended, and I went on my way. A few months later, I ran into my old boss, Joe, and I told him I ran into someone that said he was his son, and asked just to make sure he didn't have a son. He said, "Nope. Not that I know of." I still don't know what to make of that encounter, but it was bizarre to say the least. My theory is that I somehow entered an alternate universe or reality, but I don't know. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing. Who knows? The following is a story from DSLY4425, who writes about a possible glitch in the Matrix. I remember writing a term paper in college about a specific disease and disease process that still exists to this day, and the treatment at the time, specifically that at the time there was no medication available on the market to treat it, although there was a lot of research being done. Fast forward 15 years, and I was debating with my pharmacist, who was also my boss, how long a medication for said disease was on the market, and we got curious and looked it up. In this dimension, the medication has been on market since the late 90s, which would have been high school for me. I definitely wouldn't have written my paper on the subject or gotten a high score on it, for that matter, if the medication really was on the market in the late 90s, as the paper was written in 2003 at the earliest. And I wrote the paper on that specific disease and process as I was working with patients directly impacted by it at the time, and had taken a good deal of extra training in my field of work, specifically with those patients, so I kind of knew my stuff and where research was heading, which at the time was developing the drugs that are now on the market, but none were out. Following story comes to us from Wolfie is Back in Black, who was in high school when this happened, living in the same neighborhood she lives in now in Mumbai. The area hadn't undergone much development back then, with dense vegetation covering what is now occupied by buildings. The Redditor was very familiar with the area, having spent her teenage years exploring its nooks and crannies with her then boyfriend. One day, they were lost in conversation and wandered towards the end of the road. Without paying attention, they turned right and accidentally walked into the last building on the lane, and what they found was very strange. In total contrast to the well-maintained surroundings, this particular building was dilapidated, like it had been bombed and set on fire. It had an eerie silence about it, devoid of the usual signs of life. No birds, no insects, nothing. There was moss growing in places and chunks of concrete had fallen off. They'd even seen the building. They had never seen the building before and hastily left, joking about the place looking like a haunted apartment. Well, 2 weeks later, she found herself in the same lane with her cousin, and lo and behold, that dystopian-looking building had completely transformed. It was painted in vibrant colors, flowers bloomed in pots, and there was vegetation surrounding it that would have taken months to grow. She approached a guard who was stationed nearby and asked him if the building had been recently renovated, and he looked at her like she was crazy and just said, no. From Reddit user Star884, we have the blue truck. The story goes as follows. My mother and I were on our way to a funeral. We stopped by the corner gas station to grab drinks on the way. I was in the passenger seat, my mom was driving. She turns around, not moving, but the car is in gear to where I thought she was backing out of the spot. I always look in the mirrors when anyone is reversing, just a natural habit. So thinking she's backing out, I was like, whoa, wait, there's someone coming. I saw a pretty big light blue truck coming very fast behind us. My mom says, cool, I see it, and stops. All of a sudden, there is another car coming pretty fast on the complete opposite side. The freaking blue truck disappeared though, just gone. It had nowhere to go. We were all literally about to crash all three cars. Somehow, it was gone. So my mom and I both saw the big light blue truck coming. We either had something happen or we had a shared delusion. And finally, we have a strange story from Reddit user London Mama 2019 who had a very strange experience in a graveyard. Probably the last place you'd want to have a strange experience in. I had taken my 6-year-old for a walk to the playground. We just moved houses, so didn't know the area well. So I checked my Apple Maps to see if there was a quicker way home, as my little one was starting to complain a bit. The quickest way was through a graveyard. We started walking and the birds were singing. It was quite sunny, perfectly normal. As we walked further though, the atmosphere just changed. It's really hard to explain, but it felt completely flat. No birds, no people, just a really oppressive feeling. We also noticed that some things looked not quite right, like gravestones facing in different directions. I'd never seen this before and it was bizarre. Some were in rows, some sideways, some facing the opposite direction, and there was a huge pile of dirt against the side of the little church. I didn't want to scare my daughter, so kept chatting. Then she seemed to notice it too and said, "This is horrible, I don't like it here." I checked my map and it had gone crazy. It was directing us the opposite way and kept changing and moving around. I followed the path round, and as the main street came into view, everything seemed to go back to normal. Birds, people, traffic sounds, even the sun seemed to get brighter. When we got home, we talked about it. I told my husband, my daughter called it the creepy graveyard. The following week we went back to show my husband, but it was like a different place, no weird vibes at all. It was very peaceful but completely normal, and we couldn't find the gravestones facing different ways. I read a book last week about time slips, and the way it felt was described by a few people who had experienced time slips. So now I'm wondering if this could be what happened to us. It said Europe had collapsed into a civil war with Greece and Ireland occupied by coalition forces facing nationalist insurgencies, that the US was deep in a depression and the global financial system was in chaos. Albert took screenshots of the pages. After he woke up, those pictures were still on his phone. Yes, he shared them on a Reddit post. This experience led him to wonder about parallel universes, pointing to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The idea that every decision creates a split, a different timeline. So Albert thinks somehow, just for a day, he slipped into one of those darker alternate realities. 6 years ago, Reddit user Peeny Bino shared a pretty unsettling experience. She was driving to work, stopped in a left turn lane when a car pulled up behind her. Out of nowhere, this intense cold fear hit her. It was like she just knew the car was going to crash into them. The car behind stopped gently a few yards back, but the fear didn't go away. Then things got even weirder. She felt this sudden jolt through her body, so strong it felt like the car actually moved with her. Checking the rear mirror, the other car was still there. The light turned green, and just before she took her foot off the brake, an excruciating pain exploded in her neck and head. She also noticed a strong smell and a taste of gasoline. It was overwhelming. She slowly rolled down the window, moved through the intersection, and gave an apologetic wave to the driver behind her. Pino Bino pulled into the office parking lot, trembling. The pain and gasoline smell, they eventually went away, but she was still shaken for the rest of the day. She even felt afraid to get back into the car at the end of the day. She called her fiancé, who joked, "Maybe you died in a car accident in an alternate universe and you felt it." Pino Bino just laughed that off at the time, but says she hasn't been able to shake that idea since. Years ago, a now deleted Reddit user shared a haunting story in an Ask Reddit thread about feeling a deep connection to someone they met in a dream. He explained that during his last semester at college, he was tackled by a massive football player, 325 pounds compared to his 120. He was unconscious for a little bit, but ended up being okay. He met an amazing woman, and after months of chasing her and dealing with a few jerk boyfriends, they ended up getting married. Soon after, they had a daughter. He had a good job, his wife stayed home to take care of the kid, and when their daughter was 2, they had a son. Life was almost picture perfect, but one day, while sitting on the couch, he noticed something off about a lamp in his room. Its perspective was inverted, like it was 3D, but just wrong. He couldn't look away, staying up all night staring at it. The next morning, he didn't go to work. Over the next few days, he stopped eating and barely left the couch, completely fixated on this lamp. His wife started getting worried, called someone to talk to him, but he knew something was really wrong here. It was like his mind was unraveling. Eventually, he had an epiphany. That lamp wasn't real. Neither was his house, the wife, the kids, or the last 10 years of his life. That's when the lamp grew bigger in his vision, turning everything red while he heard screams and felt intense pain. And he suddenly woke up, lying on the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers. He was still on the ground, just having come back too from being tackled by the football player. In the brief time he'd been unconscious, he'd imagined an entire life. But it felt very real to him, too real. In his own words, "I went through about 3 years of horrid depression. I was grieving the loss of my wife and children, dealing with the knowledge that they never existed. I was scared that I was going insane, as I would cry myself to sleep, hoping I would see her in my dreams. I never have, but sometimes I see my son, usually just a glimpse out of my peripheral vision. He's perpetually 5 years old, and I can never hear what he says." This next story comes from Gunzo, who said he once dreamed he was driving home, listening to old music, when he spotted a badly damaged car on the side of the road. He stops, calls for help, and finds an unconscious young woman with short curly blonde hair inside. Drags her out, gives her first aid, until an ambulance arrives. When he glanced back at the woman though, she was suddenly wide awake and shocked, and that's when he woke up. Well, weeks go by, and his uncle gives him a family photo collage for his birthday. Among the pictures was his mom, young, pregnant at the time. She was also covered in scars. In fact, she looked exactly like the woman from his dream. When he told his dad about this, his dad said, well, a man rescued his mom after a car accident 25 years earlier, and then mysteriously vanished. Redditor this_IUS shared a strange story about his friend Gavin, who he said was incredibly smart, like higher IQ than anyone he knew. This happened when they were teens. One day, the Reddit user made an impromptu stop at Gavin's place. He knocked on the door and was shocked when a middle-aged man answered. It was not Gavin's dad. And things only got stranger. When he asked if Gavin was home, the man said, "I am Gavin." The man looked very confused. After some back and forth, the man was like, "Okay, yeah, he'll be back later." It seemed he just wanted to be left alone. Well, later, when the Redditor told Gavin about this, Gavin insisted no one else had been there, and he'd been home the whole time, too. This led to a theory. Had that middle-aged man actually been Gavin, a future version of him that had somehow, briefly, slipped back in time?
Number 10, you have to arrest me. One fateful day, a man who claimed to be Nathaniel Leonard walked into a police station. He confessed to unspeakable crimes and handed over detailed evidence claiming responsibility for multiple heinous acts, unalivings that, according to him, were meticulously planned and executed. The evidence Leonard presented was chilling: photographs, journals, and disturbingly precise accounts of each crime. He pleaded with the authorities, practically begging to be incarcerated. However, as the police delved deeper into Leonard's confessions, an unsettling reality emerged. They meticulously cross-checked his claims, searched for any signs of missing persons matching his descriptions, or evidence of the gruesome acts he committed. Yet, to their confoundment, they found nothing. No missing people, no corroborative evidence, nothing that could substantiate Leonard's horrifying confessions. As a matter of fact, they couldn't even find evidence of his own existence. The apartment he claimed to rent had been occupied by another tenant, and even his supposed place of work claimed to never have known him. Despite his pleas, there was no legal ground to charge Leonard with any crime, and with no identifiable victims, no evidence beyond what was circumstantial, the hands of justice were tied. The police released Leonard back into the world where he was never heard from again. The man who yearned for imprisonment, seeking absolution through punishment, slipped away into obscurity, leaving a community bewildered and haunted by the specter of his confessions that couldn't be proven. But perhaps in the universe next door, the families of those affected by his atrocities still seek justice. At number 9 is the time-traveling serial unaliver. The stories of a series of gruesome unalivings that happened between 89 and 91. The perpetrator, later identified as Jonathan Carter, was a seemingly ordinary man with an extraordinary claim. He professed to be a time traveler from the future on a mission to prevent catastrophic events by taking lives in the present. Jonathan's bizarre modus operandi and cryptic messages left investigators dumbfounded. Each victim was meticulously chosen, with Jonathan citing their futures as catalysts for impending disaster. He believed that eliminating these individuals would alter the course of history, preventing an event that would devastate the world. As the bodies piled up and Jonathan's confessions became more elaborate, the authorities struggled to comprehend his twisted rationale. Now, during the trial, Jonathan maintained his unwavering belief in his mission. He spoke calmly of a future apocalypse, asserting that his actions were a necessary sacrifice to avert global catastrophe. However, the court, unable to accept such outlandish claims, found him guilty on multiple counts of unaliving. Despite pleas from some who believed his delusionary mission and others who argued for mental health evaluation, the justice system prevailed and Jonathan Carter was sentenced to lethal injection for his heinous crimes. Jonathan maintained his story until his very last breath. His last words? "I wasn't finished. You're all doomed." If you're enjoying the video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 8 is the Philip Fraser disappearance. Philip Fraser was heading home from college, which was a crazy long drive from Alaska to Maryland. On his way, he picked up a hitchhiker, even though he'd initially said no. See, the hitchhiker seemed off, and he was later described by cafe staff as seeming as though he had just busted out of a mental institution. Later on, this hitchhiker got picked up by another couple because he claimed that his car was acting up. But get this, he claimed that he was the real Philip, acting all sus and carrying 2 wallets. Then things went bonkers as Philip's car was later found burned up in the woods, but with no sign of him or a struggle. The police faced a dead end as both the hitchhiker and Fraser were never seen again, almost as if they were whisked away into a parallel universe. At number 7 is the Ben Padilla plane jacking. In 2003, Ben Padilla and a mechanic pulled off a real Houdini act. They snuck into this Boeing 747, chilling at an Angolan airport, revved it up, and zoom, off they went, never to be seen again. No plane, no bad guys, nada. Now, Ben's family has been on the hunt to solve this mystery. Some reckon that Ben didn't sign up for this joyride willingly. They suspect he was forced into playing pilot. Sadly to say, chances are that Ben might not be around anymore. Once the plane reached its mysterious destination, those involved probably had to cover their tracks. The big puzzle pieces: who's the mastermind behind this airborne escapade, and where is that colossal 747 hiding now? At number 6 is the Great War in Britain reality. This is a story I found on r/nosleep by a user named Albert Norman that also comes with some screenshots to back up his claims. So picture this: instead of the regular music on the radio, his Monday morning's radio station is talking talking about the victory in the Great War. There's nothing like that happening, right? News, people at work, even in the streets were talking about this victory in Italy and something about a second Great Depression ending. Things went from weird to weirder when he entered his workplace and nobody seemed to know who he was. On top of that, the city looked run down, things were falling apart, and the news was talking about wars and chaos all over Europe. To make sense of this, the user checked out Wikipedia and found some crazy stuff, like Europe was in chaos, wars were happening, economies were crashing harder than ever. To make sure they weren't dreaming, they took screenshots of everything. And guess what? When they woke back in our reality, the pictures were still there. At number 5 is the Shadow Man. Some say that ghosts and the supernatural are really just our universe briefly intertwining with another, which makes the following story from Reddit so much scarier. Picture this, a tall, shadowy figure wearing a suit and a top hat. The user had been seeing this thing since they were little and had been messing with them big time. At first they thought they were just imagining stuff, being a kid and all, but as they got older, it grew stronger, turning off lights, messing around with sinks, and moving things around. Fast forward, and they thought it'd be cool to play around with the Ouija board, which was a bad idea. Things went from weird to terrifying real quick, as that shadow dude he'd been seeing for years, turns out he was now tied to the board, and he got super intense, actually scratching the person and leaving bruises. They tried everything to get rid of it, like holy water, tossing the board, but nothing worked. Now, the Shadow Man is still around, causing havoc. The homie who wrote this is desperate for any ideas to make it stop. Moral of the story, don't mess around with the paranormal, because it's no joke.
Bermuda Island. This is a very curious little oddity. So there's supposed to be a small island located in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula called Bermuda. It used to be on maps dating back to the 16th century, but it seems to have vanished. The island first shows up on maps from the late 1500s. It was also mentioned in all sorts of historical records. For a long time, Bermuda Island was considered to be a legitimate place. It was even used to help define maritime borders in the Gulf of Mexico. But by the late 1800s, it seemed as if the island had completely disappeared. And in 2009, a Mexican government search team confirmed that no island matching Bermuda's description could be found in the Gulf of Mexico. So, what happened? Was it destroyed or submerged after a big storm? Possibly. Or is there a stranger possibility? Could the island somehow have been shifted to another dimension? Or maybe this is a very extreme case of a Mandela effect, where in one reality the island was there, but in this current one, it never was.
James Tedford, 56, and his wife Pearl Tedford were living in Vermont at the end of World War II. After his service, James returned home to learn that his wife had completely vanished, seemingly into thin air. He questioned neighbors, friends, family, and even got the police involved, but no one could figure out where she had gone. The only information they were able to gather was that she was last seen walking to the Ameco store when she suddenly vanished. After spending a few years looking for his wife, defeated and lonely, James checked himself into a soldier's home. Just 2 years after that, he vanished. He had boarded a bus from Vermont back to the soldier's home, but before he ever made it to his destination, he disappeared. All 14 passengers who boarded the bus recall seeing him, but he was gone by the time they reached their stop. Only his luggage remained, neatly tucked away into the luggage rack. No other stops had been made along the way, so it didn't make any sense that James had just disappeared. Unless, of course, he somehow slipped into another dimension, hopefully one where he and his wife lived happily ever after.
In 1975, Travis Walton, a logger from Arizona, and his crew had finished up a long day in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. As Walton and his crew were driving home, they suddenly spotted something, a bright red light in the distance, hovering over the trees. They decided to drive closer to investigate, and what they saw was something none of them had ever seen before. They were completely awestruck. Hovering above them was some sort of aircraft, and it was definitely not a helicopter. Then, in the midst of all this shock and confusion, Walton decided to get out of the car to get a closer look. His friends yelled at him to get back in the truck, but he continued walking closer, and that's when he claimed he was struck by a beam of light from the mysterious aircraft and lifted off the ground. And that's when the rest of the crew, understandably panicked, sped off. But as they drove further and further away, they knew they couldn't just leave him there. They rushed back, but Walton was now nowhere to be found. Of course, the police were contacted and the search for him became a major story, but no trace of Walton was discovered for 5 days. Then suddenly, he reappeared, confused and disoriented, but he was there and alive. Walton's explanation for where he'd been was pretty harrowing. He said he'd been taken inside a UFO where he saw beings he described as aliens who attempted to experiment on him before he fought them off and escaped deeper into whatever this strange craft was. And then he woke up and was back in town. His account was detailed and he, as well as the rest of the crew, passed polygraph tests. This incident became one of the most famous and well-documented alien abduction cases in history and was even turned into a book and film, Fire in the Sky.
On December 17th of 1976, Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of Australia, vanished after going for a swim in the waters of Cheviot Beach near Melbourne. Holt was 59 at the time, but he was incredibly fit and in pretty peak athletic condition for his age. Yet to this day, no sign of the Prime Minister has ever been found. No remains, no clothes, no note telling anyone where he was going, no sign of struggle, nothing. He simply vanished without warning. While there are some theories that suggest he fell victim to riptides, like I said, his remains have never been found. Other theories claim that he might have been taken by the Soviet Union or even a Chinese submarine because of his support for the Vietnam War, or even that he was abducted by aliens. But of course, there is one more theory. It's the reason why you clicked on this video, and that theory is that perhaps he slipped into an alternate reality where he spent the rest of his days living a simple life on the Australian countryside. One can only hope.
The Sodder family case is one that's been baffling people for decades. On Christmas Eve in 1945, the Sodder family's home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, caught fire. The parents, George and Jenny Sodder, and 4 of their sons and daughters managed to escape, but 5 others, Maurice, Martha, Louise, Jenny, and Betty, were presumed to have been trapped inside the house, never making it out. But the thing is, no remains were ever found, which led to all sorts of theories, starting with the Sodders themselves, who weren't convinced that they died in the fire. And while this could, of course, just have been a case of 2 grieving parents not wanting to accept the truth, there are some interesting details about this case. What the parents believed was that the missing youngsters had been kidnapped and that the fire was a cover-up. There were some suspicious details, like the phone lines having been cut, and witnesses reporting seeing a strange man near the house shortly before the fire. And over the years, the Sodders started receiving mysterious tips and supposed sightings of their sons and daughters. They even had a private investigator look into the case, but unfortunately, no solid evidence was ever found.
Now, this first case is very, very strange. In 1880, a farmer named David Lang reportedly vanished into thin air while walking across a field on his property near Gallatin, Tennessee. There were multiple witnesses, including his wife, his 2 children, and 2 visitors arriving in a horse-drawn buggy. They said Lang was mid-step when he literally just disappeared. There was no flash of light, he hadn't fallen or gone behind a tree, he was there 1 second and then he wasn't. The group ran to where he'd been standing, expecting to find a sinkhole or some kind of trap in the ground, but the earth was solid. They searched the area for days. Neighbors joined in, but no sign of Lang was ever found. The only thing that changed was the grass where he had vanished. It turned sort of like it decayed. It turned yellow and brittle, and for years afterward, nothing would grow there. Then, months later, Lang returned. Sort of. His daughter was playing in a field looking for 4-leafed clovers, and that's when she heard it. A voice that sounded a lot like her father, calling for help. It was faint, like it was coming from underground or from behind a wall. It happened more than once, but each time they checked, there was still nothing. Eventually, even the voice stopped. The story was pretty well known at the time. It showed up in the newspaper, and the names, place, and details were consistent with public records. Was it fabricated? Maybe, but everyone there that day remained adamant about what they saw. In 2006, Carol Chase McKelney was driving through Riverside County, California on her way home from a dog show. As she passed through her old hometown of Riverside, she figured she'd take a quick detour to see the neighborhood she grew up in. It had been years since she visited and she was curious to see how much it had changed. Except, it wasn't her town. The street names were right, the general layout looked familiar, But her childhood home was completely gone, and so were all of the houses around it. The neighborhood had totally changed, like it had been wiped out and replaced with strange, unfamiliar buildings. She went to look for her grandmother's house. Gone too. Her old school was nowhere to be found. Even the cemetery where several family members were buried didn't look the same. The graves were different and the whole place just felt wrong, like a dream version of her hometown. Completely shook, she got out of there, and it wasn't until years later that she felt the courage to come back. But this time, everything was normal. Her grandmother's house was there, her childhood home too, the school, everything was just like it always had been. So, what happened? Carol was completely sober, not tired, not on medication. She knew what she saw and what she didn't see. She swore up and down that for a few strange hours, she stepped into some alternate version of her hometown, a place almost like hers, but not quite. In 1978, 23-year-old Stephen Kubacki was a college student studying German at Hope College in Michigan. One February afternoon, he went cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan and never came back. The next day, his skis and backpack were found near the edge of the frozen lake. There were footprints leading out onto the ice, and then nothing. Search and rescue teams looked for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. Everyone assumed the same thing, that he had fallen through the ice and died. Except, 15 months later, he showed up. Stephen woke up on a grassy hill in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, over 700 miles away from where he disappeared. He was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, with a satchel full of maps he didn't remember collecting. He had a t-shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin, which he didn't recall running, and his last memory was being on the ice. He walked to his aunt's house nearby, and from there eventually reconnected with his parents. Nobody had seen or heard from him in a year and 3 months, but all things considered, he looked healthy. He was just confused like everybody else. When asked what happened, Stephen said he had no idea. He didn't remember anything. It was like someone had hit a reset button on his brain. To this day, he still doesn't talk much about it, and after the incident, he went back to school, earned a degree, and eventually became a clinical psychologist, which is kind of wild considering he's got one of the strangest unsolved disappearance stories on record. But I guess also maybe that makes him the perfect person for the job, you know? In March of 2017, Bruno Borges, a 24-year-old psychology student from Brazil, vanished without a trace. His family had last seen him at their home in Rio Branco, and when they realized he hadn't taken his phone, wallet, or anything useful for a getaway, they went into his locked bedroom. And that is when things got really strange. The entire room had been turned into some kind of cryptic research lab. The furniture was gone, replaced with a giant statue of a 16th century philosopher who believed in infinite worlds and extraterrestrials. There were also pages and pages of handwritten text covering the walls, floor to ceiling. Over 14 books worth written in a bizarre code nobody could read. Bruno's family had no idea any of this was going on. He'd apparently been working on it in secret for months. When news about his disappearance came out, internet sleuths obsessed over his case. His encrypted writings were eventually partially decoded. They talked about personal evolution, contact with higher beings, and preparing humanity for something bigger. But still, no one knew where he went. But after 5 months of silence, Bruno showed up back home, barefoot. He wouldn't say much about where he'd been, only that he'd been working on his ideas. His family and police said he was in good health, mentally stable, and not on any substances. He didn't really give interviews, and most of the public still doesn't know why he left or what exactly he was trying to do. In 1935, British Royal Air Force officer Victor Goddard was flying a biplane over an abandoned airfield near Edinburgh, Scotland. I think that's how you say it, and everyone in the comments is gonna be like, that's not how you say it. Well, I'm not Scottish, so I don't know what you want me to do. The place was falling apart, overgrown with weeds, buildings crumbling, not a soul in sight. A few days later, he flew the same route again, but this time, something was off. As he approached the airfield, a sudden storm hit. Thick, swirling clouds, heavy rain, turbulence. Then, just as fast, the sky cleared. Everything looked brighter. Unnaturally so. The airfield below was no longer abandoned, the buildings were intact, freshly painted, planes were on the ground, yellow ones, which wasn't the standard RAF color at the time, and mechanics in blue overalls were moving around, working on them. None of this made sense in 1935. The colors, the uniforms, the specific model of aircraft he saw, they weren't part of the Air Force yet. When he told people what he'd seen, they thought he was just confused or mistaken. But a few years later, during World War II, that same airfield was brought back to life. It was restored, the planes were painted yellow, and the mechanics wore blue coveralls, just like Goddard had described. It was as if he had seen the future. No one could explain it then, and no one really can now, and Goddard wasn't some nut. He was an air marshal. Dead serious, no nonsense, and he swore up and down till his death that this actually happened.
And number 4 is Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists to the US after World War II for various projects, including the Manhattan Project, which went on to produce the nuclear bomb. Fun fact that I didn't know before scripting this video, actually the founder of NASA was part of this Operation Paperclip, having worked closely with Hitler, which is pretty scary. Now, aside from NASA and the Manhattan Project, there are a bunch of other projects still classified to this day that the US had the Germans working on. Some details about what happened to certain scientists after the contracts ended remain unclear, leading to speculations and rumors. When the tenure of some of these scientists ended, poof, they just disappeared off the radar. Records showed that the government assigned them to other various projects, top secret stuff, but all those paper trails just seemed to vanish into thin air. Now here's where it gets wild. There are whispers that some of these scientists, after their Manhattan gig, these geniuses weren't just twiddling their thumbs. Some say that the government had them working on a wild experiment, opening a wormhole to another dimension. Did they pull it off? Did they flee to Argentina? Or hold your breath, did they skip into an alternate reality? Nobody knows. Maybe they're sipping tea in a parallel universe, laughing at us all trying to figure out. At number 3, Lars Matanik's strange behavior during his Bulgaria trip is a real head scratcher. After a brawl over soccer teams that seriously messed up his ear, he stuck around for a few days to heal while his friends left without him. But his behavior got even weirder, texting his family about safety concerns and asking them to cancel his credit card. When he tried to fly back home a week later, things got even more bizarre. At the airport, he wanted a doctor's thumbs up due to his ear injury, but then he bolted out of that office like a lightning bolt, vanishing without a trace. The details on Lars's actions before that moment paint a kind of confusing picture. His mates noticed that he wasn't eating much and acted offbeat while they were there. They said that he hardly ate during the vacation, wasn't keen on food I guess, and had a showdown over soccer before his ear took a hit. Now, did all this stir up a mental storm? Consider this, and it's just a theory, but could this possibly have been a precursor to a psychotic episode? Signs like odd behavior, eating and sleeping changes, aggression, and delusions can precede it. Not to mention, if he received enough head trauma to bust open his ear, he's probably gonna have a few screws loose up in his noggin. Or maybe he just disappeared into a parallel universe. At number 2 is Tupac. The disappearance of Tupac, the influential rapper and cultural icon, remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in the music industry. After the tragic shooting incident in '96 that led to his untimely demise, or so it was believed, rumors and conspiracy theories about his disappearance began to circulate, seeing as there had been reported sightings of him all throughout Cuba, even though he had just passed away. Now, one theory to explain this was that this Cuban Tupac was actually from another universe. Numerous eyewitnesses attested to seeing Tupac in various locations after his reported demise, fueling the belief that he had somehow transcended into another dimension, maybe even transcended the state of being unalived itself. Reports of sightings in secluded areas, coupled with purported encounters where he showcased an uncharacteristic demeanor, add weight to the notion that Tupac may have slipped into an alternate reality. Despite extensive investigations by law enforcement and dedicated fans tirelessly scrutinizing every detail, no conclusive evidence of Tupac's fate or whereabouts have ever emerged. At number 1, we live in the wrong reality. I thought I would finish us off here today with an eerie story from r/nosleep. The post is called The Truth About Parallel Universes, and it goes something like this. It's a bit long, so bear with me. I'm from a parallel universe, and for the moment, I'm stuck here. No, I don't mean I experienced a glitch in the Matrix, nor do I mean I erroneously remember Mandela dying in prison and concluded being from a parallel universe is a much more plausible explanation than the unreliability of human memory. I mean, I deliberately came here from a parallel universe using a machine developed by generations of scientists. Being here, I feel obligated to share some information with you that you're not aware of due to the fact that you haven't developed the technology to travel between parallel realities. The knowledge I'm going to share with you is going to upset a lot of you. You see, universe hopping is quite common in other realities. Now, one thing you guys got right inside sci-fi is that parallel universes are pretty similar to each other. So when one goes universe hopping, for lack of a better term, it's standard procedure to exchange all the information about parallel universes we know of between each other, and all this data is accessible to us. Now, for some reason, your universe in the Sumerian civilization fell instead of acting as a great unifying force, eventually bringing the Roman, Egyptian, and Chinese empires into international union. What you call the Enlightenment happened some 2,000 years too late from my perspective. The bubonic plague never happened anywhere else. When your Europeans reached what you call the Americas, not only did you not know who they were, but you inadvertently, and later very intentionally, disseminated the native population by infecting them with diseases that they had no natural immunity to. How do you understand how truly exceptional this is? There are literally only 4 other universes where this contact happened before the invention of vaccines, and there are no universes in which the Americas didn't have their own international union. To put things into perspective, before you, the least technologically advanced reality we found had just finished colonizing the entire solar system. You're all living in the worst version of reality. That was pretty depressing. I really hope that's not true.
In 2008, a woman named Lorena Garcia from Spain woke up and immediately felt something was off. At first, it was little things. Her bed sheets were different, her pajamas weren't the ones she remembered putting on the night before. Confused, she chalked it up to grogginess and just got ready for work. But when she got to the office, the weirdness escalated. She'd been working at the same place for 20 years, but when she arrived, she realized she didn't work in the same department anymore. She was listed under a completely different role, one she swore she'd never been assigned. Her boss, her coworkers, the whole structure was different, but it got worse. She reached out to her ex-boyfriend, who she'd broken up with months earlier, only to find out that they'd never broken up at all. According to him, they were still together. The man she had been dating, who she'd just seen a few days ago, was nowhere to be found. His number didn't even work. It was like he never existed. Lorena genuinely believed she'd woken up in a different version of reality, one nearly identical to her own, but with very key differences. She went to doctors, psychologists, everyone she could think of trying to explain what happened, but no one had an answer. She was healthy, her memory was sharp, yet her life didn't match her memories. And to this day, Lorena insists that she's from somewhere else, that she somehow crossed into a parallel dimension and has been stuck here ever since. In May of 1972, 4 girls from Southern Utah University were driving home after a rodeo when they took a shortcut through Gadianton Canyon, near the Utah-Nevada border. Around 10 p.m., the road beneath them changed from black asphalt to smooth white cement. The desert landscape gave way to unfamiliar grain fields and towering pines, not at all what they expected in southern Utah. Thinking they were lost, they turned around. Then they spotted a small roadside tavern and pulled over to ask for directions. Before anyone could get out, one of the girls screamed. Heading towards them were 4 strange egg-shaped vehicles with tricycle-style wheels and glowing lights. The girls, completely panicked, jumped back in the car and tore off through the canyon. As suddenly as it started, the strange scenery disappeared and the road returned to normal. They eventually crashed into a creek, damaging her car and flattening 3 tires. At dawn, they hiked to the highway and flagged down a trooper named Victoria Lindquist, who was shocked and confused to find that their tire tracks ended abruptly 600 feet into the desert. And despite being found miles from the road, no one could explain how they got there. One hubcap was also missing, which was never found. Back in the 1800s, there was a man named William Cantello, an eccentric British inventor obsessed with creating a rapid-fire automatic weapon. After years of work, he told his family he was heading to the market to sell his invention, and he never came back home. Roughly 20 years later, an American inventor named Hiram Maxim rose to fame with, you guessed it, a rapid-fire automatic firearm. Maxim also looked strikingly similar to Cantello, so much so that Cantello's own children were convinced he was their father. The resemblance became such a nuisance that Maxim addressed it in his autobiography, claiming someone had been impersonating him. Now, that may have been the case. It was just a coincidence that he not only looked just like another man, but also took up the same vocation. But some believe Cantello faked his disappearance and took on a new identity, or that Cantello and Maxim were the same person from 2 different realities, and at some point they switched places pieces, leaving both men stuck in the wrong timeline. This has to be one of the strangest missing persons cases that I have ever heard. In 1763, in a quiet English town of Shepton Mallet, a man named Owen Parfitt vanished without a trace. He was old, frail, and paralyzed. He couldn't walk, couldn't dress himself, he barely moved. Locals say he was a former sailor with a shady past, but by the time this story takes place, he was basically bedridden. Well, one warm evening, Owen was sitting outside his sister's cottage, propped in a chair, enjoying the breeze. His sister and a neighbor helped him outside, then they went inside for a bit. They claimed they were gone maybe 15 minutes, and when they came back, the chair was there, still facing the road, but Owen was gone. Now, this wasn't a busy area. It wasn't like someone could sneak up, lift a full-grown man who couldn't walk, and then vanish without making a sound, but it seemed like that's exactly what happened. People searched the fields, wells, nearby roads. Nothing. Days passed, then weeks. Rumors spread. Some started to wonder if he'd just been faking the paralysis for years before finally deciding to... what? Wander off into the wilderness alone? I don't know. It's not a good option. The theories? I don't know. I've got no new ones. In 1961, a girl named Terry Jo Duperalt went on what was supposed to be a dream family vacation, a week-long cruise on a rented sailboat in the Bahamas. But just a few days in, everything went horribly wrong. Terry Jo woke up one night to the sound of footsteps and her brother screaming. When she went topside, she found the deck covered in blood. Her mother and brother were dead. The captain, Julian Harvey, was the only adult left standing, and when he saw her, he didn't say a word, he just stared. She went back below deck, terrified. Minutes later, water started flooding in. The boat was sinking. She escaped onto a small floaty and drifted alone for nearly 4 days under the scorching sun. Dehydrated, sunburned, and half-conscious, she was eventually rescued by a Greek freighter. The fact that she survived at all was almost a miracle. Captain Harvey was rescued days earlier in a lifeboat and told authorities that the boat sank in a freak accident. He said that everyone else was lost at sea, but when he found out Terry Jo survived, he took his own life immediately. She never saw him kill her family, but everyone believes that that is exactly what happened, probably for insurance money. Still, there are holes in the story, and what Terry Jo saw that night, she never fully talked about. Some say she blocked it all out, others think something even darker went down. Till this day, though, the case has never really been solved. There is a book about this, if you're interested. I think it's called like Orphan Lost at Sea or something like that. And also, if you're a fan of the podcast MFM, if you know, you know, in one of their recap episodes that they're doing right now, the rewinds, they just did this one like a few weeks ago, so go listen to that, read the book. The story's crazy, you guys, that's just crazy. This little girl's just lost at sea, then she's found, and everything was okay for her. Then that's the important part of the story.
When James Leininger was just 2 years old, he started having violent nightmares about crashing in a plane. He'd wake up screaming about being stuck in a fire or yelling things like airplane crash and the little man can't get out. During the day, he started naming aircraft parts most toddlers wouldn't know existed, things like drop tanks and Corsairs. He also kept saying he'd flown off a ship called the Natoma and that his name had been James. His parents eventually looked into it and discovered the USS Natoma Bay was a real World War II aircraft carrier. They found a pilot on its roster named James Huston Jr. who died in combat. The plane was shot down and exploded. James the toddler also named another pilot from that crew who was still alive at the time, and when they met, the child recognized him instantly. On top of that, James could recall specific events and details of battles that matched Navy records. His parents had never really talked to him about this stuff at home, and none of it was in any children's books. As he got older, the memories started to fade, but for a while, it seemed like this kid was actually remembering a past life. At 4 years old, Shanti Devi in India started insisting that she had another family in a different town. She told her parents she wasn't really their daughter, that her real name was Lugdi Devi, and she'd lived in Mathura, about 75 miles away. She said she died giving birth to a son and gave the the full name of her husband, the town he lived in, what he looked like, and even the layout of their house. At first, everyone thought she was just making things up, but when they actually looked into it, her descriptions lined up. A man named Kedar Nath lived in Mathura, had a wife named Lugdi who died during childbirth, and had a son. When Shanti met him, she instantly recognized him and greeted him like she knew him. She also correctly pointed out places and people in towns she'd supposedly never seen. Word got around and the case became so well known that a commission was set up by order of Gandhi himself. They interviewed witnesses, retraced her claims, and found that almost everything she said had a real-world match. Cameron McCulley was a regular kid growing up in Glasgow, until around age 5 when he started talking non-stop about a place called the Isle of Barra. He claimed he used to live there in a white house by the sea with a black and white dog and a family that he really missed. He talked about planes landing on the beach, his old dad named Shane Robertson, and how his old life had ended when he, quote, fell through. His parents had never even mentioned Barra before, but Cameron was convinced. Eventually they took him to the island, and it turned out there really was a white house by the sea, just like he described. But I mean, whatever, right? A white house, it's not like there aren't any other white houses in the world. Well, this one belonged to a Robertson family, again, just like young Cameron had described. Cameron was walking around like he'd been there before, naming things and pointing out details that lined up with what he'd talked about before. There were no obvious signs of how he could have known any of this. And his memories seemed emotional, not just factual. It didn't seem like he was just repeating stuff. It was as if he was genuinely grieving a life he'd left behind. In 1987, a little girl named Purnima Akanayak was born in Bakumana, Sri Lanka. She was like most kids, except for the fact that she kept talking about being crushed by a heap of iron. She'd also always tell her mother things like people who drive over others are bad, which is of course true, but it was odd that she seemed particularly focused on that specific thing, driving over someone. And when her mom got upset about a car accident that had happened one day, Purnima calmly told her not to worry because she had also died in a crash. She said a big vehicle hit her and she never made it to the hospital. Things got weirder when she started saying she used to make incense, and their name had used to be Jinadasa. She also described 2 types of incense, how she made them, and how she used to walk around with her hands behind her back, supervising workers. She also claimed she lived across the river from a temple, which was over 140 miles away from her actual home. When her family finally took her there, she started pointing out familiar places and recognized people by name. And man she used to be, who'd died in a car accident, he was real. His name was Janadasa Pereira, and he died in 1985, 2 years before Purnima was born, when a bus ran him over while he was selling incense on his bike. And to top it off, she had a birthmark exactly where Pereira's chest had been crushed. Since childhood, Jenny Cockle would have recurring dreams of being a woman named Mary Sutton, who lived in Ireland, had several children, and died young in the 1930s. As she got older, Jenny became obsessed with finding out if Mary was real. She started piecing together what she remembered, names, locations, and the layout of Mary's old home. Eventually, she tracked down a town in Ireland that matched. She discovered that a woman named Mary Sutton had lived there and had died, leaving behind children. Jenny eventually reached out to them, now elderly, and met with them in person. And to their surprise, she knew all these intimate details about their lives, their personalities as kids, and even specific incidents from their childhood that had never been published or shared. One of the sons in particular became convinced that Jenny really was his mother reincarnated. He said she had the same mannerisms and emotional connection to them that Mary had. Imad Alawar was just under 2 years old when he started telling his parents about a life he had claimed to have lived in another village about 25 miles from where he was growing up in Lebanon. He gave names, described a yellow car he used to own, and spoke about specific relatives, neighbors, and his former job. His family wasn't all that worried at first, but when Imad suddenly ran to a stranger on the street one day and hugged the man as if he recognized him, and it turned out this person was actually from the town Imad had claimed he'd lived in his past life, well, this intrigued his parents. Eventually, they contacted Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who'd been studying cases of past life memories. Stevenson documented that Imad made 47 47 specific statements about his supposed past life. When Stevenson and the LOR family visited the town, it turned out that 44 of those 47 statements matched up with the real-life story of a man named Ibrahim Boumsi, who died 5 years before Imad was born. Another important detail is that the child Imad would often talk about how thankful he was for being able to walk. Well, Ibrahim died around the age of 25 after spending a year in a sanatorium. He had tuberculosis and was confined to a bed during the final part of his life.
This first story comes from Reddit user Glitch in the Matrix, and it's pretty long, so I'm gonna have to paraphrase. The user starts off by setting the scene. They are around 18 or 19 years old, living in their childhood home. One day, they decide to go for a walk to a nearby park, which they had been doing since they were young. It was around 1 or 2 p.m. They stepped out of the front door, and all of a sudden, things just felt wrong. Everything felt different. It didn't look different, but it felt different and completely wrong. They decided to shake it off and continued their walk down to the park when they locked eyes with their neighbor, whose face went completely pale as though he had seen a ghost. Just as the neighbor was about to speak, user Glitch in the Matrix found themselves back in their house, standing at the front door, ready to leave for their walk. They stood there for a few moments in complete disbelief, but at the same time relieved, because things didn't feel different or wrong anymore. They looked down the street and the neighbor was nowhere to be found. Regardless, they decided to skip the walk for that day. The entire experience, the teleportation, and the incredibly off feeling of the neighborhood had left the user quite uneasy, even now, so many years later. Not only that, it has left them wondering if somehow momentarily they slipped into some kind of alternate reality, only to be brought back to where they truly belong just moments later. Spooky.
In March of 2006, Carol Chase McKinley was driving with her dog from San Bernardino to Paris, California. She decided to make a pit stop in Riverside, where she grew up. She had grandparents buried in a local cemetery and remembered her own time living there. Once she got there, she was shocked to find that familiar places, including her family's old homes and the cemetery, were completely unrecognizable. The cemetery was overgrown and unkempt, and the houses she remembered had been replaced by newer buildings. Even Riverside City College and Central Middle School, which she recognized, seemed oddly out of place compared to her memories. Her old neighborhood, which had once featured her grandmother's large Tudor home and her aunt's house, was now a rundown area with modern bungalows and graffiti. The banks, insurance companies, and restaurants she remembered were gone. She felt so unsettled by the changes and the ominous atmosphere that she was afraid to even stop and ask for directions. Eventually, she returned to Paris, where everything was normal. But here's the strange thing. When she went back to Riverside a few years later for her father's funeral, everything had reverted back to how she remembered it from her childhood. Her family's homes were as they had been. Everything felt right again. Now your first thought is like, well, alright, she just took a wrong turn and wasn't actually in her hometown before. But as I said, certain landmarks had been correct. Like the college and the middle school. The cemetery was also in the same spot. It was just run down. It was as if she'd driven into some strange upside down version of her childhood town.
Alright, this next story comes from Reddit user Deathstar_57, and it was actually posted to the unofficial Most Amazing Top 10 Reddit page, which we do not run, but it does have some pretty interesting stories and some pretty creepy ones too. My advice: don't read them before bed. Anyways, the story goes as follows. I got up and found my pet dead on the ground, so I buried him outside my house. But when I woke up the next morning, my pet was still dead on the ground. So I went to the spot it was first buried, and its body was still there. A few months later, I slipped off my bike and hit my head, and I was in a coma. I remember feeling movement, but I couldn't open my eyes. When I woke up, I was taken home, and after a few days, I found my dog alive outside of my yard. Now, while this entire thing could have very well likely been a coma dream, it's also entirely possible that while unconscious, this guy slipped into one or even two alternate realities in which his beloved pet didn't make it. But I'm glad that in this reality at least, Deathstar57's dog is alive and well.
In 2008, a woman named Lorena Garcia posted on an internet forum about all these strange things that had suddenly changed in her life, as if she'd suddenly shifted into another reality. The story got a decent amount of buzz at the time. According to Garcia, Garcia, who was 41 at the time, she'd woken up on what seemed like an average morning, but surprise, she'd switched realities. For starters, her pajamas and bed sheets were different than they were when she went to bed. This was odd, but nothing to panic about, so she headed off to work. When she got there though, it became clear that something was definitely off. When she got to her floor, she quickly realized she was in the wrong department, even though she'd gone to the exact location and floor she'd been going to for 20 years. She went back home only to find that her new boyfriend wasn't there either. Instead, it was the dude she'd broken up with 6 months before. She asked him what the hell he was doing in her house, and he looked at her like she was crazy. She tried calling her new boyfriend, nothing. Tried going to his house, someone else was living there. She even went as far as to hire a private detective to find him, but nothing ever turned up. So did Lorena Garcia just have a really detailed, vivid dream about some other man that never really existed, or did she happen to take a fateful fall into the Twilight Zone?
In 1947, in Tokyo's Haneda Airport, a man named John Zergus handed his passport over to the gate agent. Only thing was, his passport had been issued in a country, Torrid, that as far as we know, doesn't exist. The gate agent looked at the man, who was well dressed and calm and appeared completely normal, save his incredibly strange identification document, and questioned him about the legitimacy of the passport. John then became irritated, insisting that Torrid did in fact exist and that it was located between Spain and France. The more they questioned him, the more frustrated he became, and he even pulled out his driver's license and bank statements, all of which had been issued in this unknown Torrid place. Eventually, police stepped in, and John Zergus was taken to a hotel to be held overnight until he could be properly investigated the following morning. The hotel room John stayed in was on a high floor with no balcony, and it was guarded the entire duration of his stay, which is why officials were so incredibly baffled when they opened the door to his bedroom the next morning to find absolutely no sign of John or any of his belongings. No one could figure out how or where he'd gone. While this might sound like some kind of urban legend or old wives' tale, the case of John Zergus, who was detained in Japan for identity fraud, is a documented case in Japanese history. Whether or not the whole Torrid thing is true is up for debate, but if it is true, it certainly points to a significant glitch in reality where John was momentarily detained in our version of reality before returning, hopefully safely, to his own.
Billy Mayer is a one-armed Swiss guy who says he isn't from Earth, that he's originally from a distant star system called the Pleiades, which is a group of stars about 400 light years away. He claims that since he was a kid in the 40s, he's been in direct contact with humanoid aliens from there. He says they started teaching him things, showing him the future, and eventually taking him on their ships. One of the aliens, a woman named Samjassi or Samjas, supposedly visited him a number of times and gave him messages to pass on to humanity. And he shared a lot of these messages in the form of strange recordings he claims to come from space. He's shown weird metal samples, and he also has tons of photos and footage of supposed flying saucers. Now, the photos and footage have become a bit of a problem. A lot of people say they looked fake, like models hanging from strings. Even his ex-wife said that he made them in the kitchen. So anyway, he did end up finding his own UFO group, and he's stuck with his story, saying that he was chosen by these alien beings to help guide Earth into spiritual enlightenment. That's gonna come up a lot in this video, by the way. Alex Collier is a former US Army pilot who says he's not just in contact with aliens, that he is one, at least on a soul level. He claims his soul came from the Andromeda galaxy and that he was sent here to help wake people up. He says he's been in contact with 2 tall blue aliens since he was a kid, and that they've been feeding him information about what's really going on with Earth, like how we're being manipulated by dark forces and how we're totally screwing up our future if we don't change our course soon. He also says he spent 92 days aboard one of their ships. He's been sharing this stuff since the 90s, doing talks, writing books, and he's got a loyal group of people who believe that he is telling the truth. Again, he's not just saying aliens talked to him, he's saying he is one, at least his soul is. In his words, he's a starseed, meaning he reincarnated here from another galaxy with a mission to help humans evolve. Barbara Marciniak says she's got alien roots, specifically from a group of stars again called the Pleiades, same star system Billy Mayer hails from. She started channeling beings from there in the late 80s and says they talk through her during trance sessions, sharing messages about spiritual awakening energy shifts, and why humanity needs to get its act together. All the usual stuff. Do these aliens have anything more, interesting to share with us than how garbage we are as a species? Like, do we need to hear that from these people? I think we kind of know what's going on. Anyway, her most famous book, Bringers of the Dawn, is basically a big Q&A with the Pleiadians, and it became a hit in the New Age scene. She also calls herself a starseed, meaning she believes her soul didn't start out on Earth. Her followers believe she's part of a larger plan to help Earth ascend or evolve or something along those lines. It's kind of vague, but she's been sticking to this message for decades, and she's built an entire career around it. And now I have one talking about people like her. Is this a career? I don't really think this is a career. It's a job. Yeah. In the 70s, authors Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder started interviewing people, mostly kids, who claimed they weren't from Earth. These weren't abduction stories. These were kids saying they actually came from other planets. Some talked about living on Sirius or Orion in a past life. Others said Earth was part of a mission and they were sent here on purpose, like some kind of alien exchange program. They described their home planets in weird detail, going into how society worked and what kind of technology they used. They also said Earth felt foreign to them. Yeah, Earth feels pretty foreign to me lately too. They didn't understand human behavior. Neither do I sometimes. They had trouble fitting in, check, and sometimes they even remembered training before incarnating here. And now you're kind of losing me. Ostrander and Schroeder documented the stories and saw it as part of a growing trend of people who felt Earth wasn't their real home. Today, this idea lives on in the modern starseed movement, but back then, this was kind of new territory. Annie Besant was a spiritual teacher and writer in the early 1900s who believed she'd lived on other planets before being born on Earth. She thought souls didn't just reincarnate through different lives here on Earth, but that they moved through different planets and even different star systems. She co-wrote a book called Man, Whence, How, and Whither with C.W. Leadbeater, where they described people's supposed past lives, not just in ancient civilizations, but also on planets like Mercury and Venus. This was before we knew Venus is hot enough to melt lead, so the idea of anyone casually living there wasn't quite as ridiculous to them as it sounds now. Keyword there being not quite as ridiculous. They claimed to access these memories through clairvoyant visions during meditation. Besant believed these lives were real, and that our souls were on a long journey of spiritual development that spanned across the universe. Barbro Karlin was a Swedish writer and poet. When she was just 2 years old, though, she started telling her parents that she was Anne Frank. Her family wasn't religious, and she hadn't been taught anything about the Holocaust yet, but Barbro described details of Anne Frank's life that she shouldn't have known. What the secret annex looked like, how the rooms were arranged, and the names of the people who'd lived there. When her parents finally took her to Amsterdam at age 10, she led them straight to the building without a map or a guide. Once inside, she pointed out changes that had been made to the house since she had lived there. She also seemed terrified of men in uniforms, even if they were just policemen on the street. Barbro went on to become a well-known writer and stood by her memories well into adulthood. She said she remembered parts of her death, the fear of being taken, and a sense of injustice that followed her for years. Seme Tetsumus was born with a misshapen right ear, which his parents chalked up to a birth defect, but when he started talking, he claimed it was from being shot in the head in a past life. He'd said he'd been a man named Salim Fasli, a farmer from another village who'd been killed while working in his fields. He recognized people Salim had known, including his widow, and called her by name. He also gave names of Salim's kids and talked about private conversations and daily routines that no stranger would realistically know. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the same researcher who studied Ahmad Elawar, investigated Semi's case and found it pretty compelling. Salim had in fact been shot dead, and Semi's ear deformity was right where the bullet had entered. The way Semi talked about Salim's life was natural, like he was recalling memories instead of making things up. One of the eeriest parts was how Semi's personality was different from other kids in his village. He was more serious and cautious, traits Salim's family said matched the man that they had remembered. Chennai Chumale Wong was born in Thailand in 1967. When he was just 3 years old, he started saying he used to be a school teacher named Bua Kai. He claimed he'd been killed while riding his bicycle to work. His story got weirder when his family noticed he had two unusual birthmarks, one on the back of his head and another above his left eye. Well, Bukai was a real person who had died. And according to his autopsy report, the entry and exit wounds of the bullet that killed him matched up perfectly with Chennai's birthmarks. Chennai kept insisting he wanted to go home and would say the name of the village where he said he'd lived. Eventually, his grandma took him there, and without hesitation, he walked up to Buakai's old house. He correctly identified the man's parents and described items that had been in the home years earlier. He also remembered details like the name of Kai's bicycle and how he used to teach math. This case takes a turn from creepy to downright chilling. So a 3-year-old boy in Golan Heights, a region between Syria and Israel, started telling his family he'd been killed in a past life. He said he died when he was attacked with an axe and was buried in a nearby field. Elders in the community followed him to the spot, where they dug up a human skeleton with a wound in the skull, right where the boy said the axe had struck. Not only that, but the boy claimed to remember the name of his killer. When they confronted the man, he allegedly confessed. The whole thing was documented by Dr. Eli Lash, a respected physician known for his public health work. He said the boy's memories were disturbingly detailed, right down to the type of axe used. You might think only a handful of fringe folks claim to be from space. The modern starseed community is bigger than you'd think, with thousands of people worldwide saying their soul came from another star system. Sirius, Arcturus, Orion, the Pleiades, take your pick. According to this belief, these people incarnated on Earth to raise humanity's vibration, awake the masses, stop the apocalypse, or something equally vague but noble sounding. A lot of them say they feel homesick for a place they've never physically been. The whole movement exploded on forums like YouTube and TikTok, with people making videos like 10 signs you're a starseed, please let's not make that video, or why you never felt at home on Earth. It's become a full-on identity for some people. There are starseed coaches, starseed retreats, and a lot of it overlaps with things like crystal healing and what's called light language. Don't ask. Please don't ask, because I don't know. Bruce Allen Walton, better known by his pen name Brenton, claimed he had memories from past lives on Sirius, the star system, not the satellite radio. He wrote a bunch of conspiracy-heavy documents in the 90s, mixing UFO sightings, underground alien bases, reptilian plots, government cover-ups, all your usual hits. This one's great. Reality of the Serpent Race and the Subterranean Origin of UFOs. Look at that book cover. And I love how at the bottom left corner it says confidential monograph for your eyes only. And everyone else who buys the Kindle edition on Amazon for $9. His books were popular in UFO conspiracy circles for a while, even though they were hard to follow and kind of all over the place. He talked about secret wars between different alien species, human-alien hybrids, and a hidden network of tunnels under Earth where dark stuff was going on. And hey, I love all those ideas, I just don't really subscribe to the idea that it's all real. But I guess, who knows? Dolores Cannon was a hypnotherapist who started out doing regular past life regression, like helping people figure out if they were a Victorian chimney sweep in the past life or whatever. But things took a weird turn when her clients started describing lives that weren't just from different time periods, they were from other planets entirely. Under hypnosis, people claimed they had agreed to be born on Earth as part of some larger mission, and that they'd lived elsewhere before coming here. Some described alien worlds in detail, including their advanced technology and the training that they received before being born. And as crazy as it all sounded, Cannon didn't dismiss any of it. She wrote it all down and published book after book filled with these sessions. She thought her clients were tapping into real memories. Back in 1956, a weird UFO story started playing out near Pescara, Italy. Except this one didn't just involve strange lights in the sky, it went way, way further. A guy named Bruno Samasicia claimed he and dozens of others were regularly meeting with a group of human-looking aliens called the W56, or the W56. Some were really short, Others were over 8 feet tall, and they apparently had bases hidden underground all over Italy. The story didn't go public until Stefano Brescia, an engineer and researcher, dug into it decades later and published interviews with the people involved. According to them, these aliens were showing up for years. They were asking for help, like getting shipments of fruit or weird industrial stuff like strontium and barium nitrate. Sometimes the humans would make deliveries and the stuff would just vanish instantly, like it got teleported. There were even claims that aliens built their underground bases by flipping a switch that compressed the Earth, then closed it back up after they were done. I don't know. And here's a strange one, as if this list hasn't been strange enough already. Instead of aliens from another world, some people say there's already a group of humans living in space. This is known as the breakaway civilization theory, which claims that since at least the 60s or 70s, a hidden society of humans has been secretly building bases on the moon, Mars, maybe even further out. They're just living out there. Some whistleblowers, like former defense contractors and insiders, say this group controls top secret black budget programs, flying advanced spacecraft that most people don't even know exist. They allegedly created space colonies and mining operations totally cut off from the public and even most governments. Some theories say they've been using alien technology recovered from crashed UFOs, which helped them leapfrog decades ahead. Now, it all sounds very comic booky, but there are people who really believe this is a thing. Some even claim to be whistleblowers that worked on these secret projects.
This next story is absolutely wild. Not only do we have people ending up in a place they don't recognize, seemingly out of nowhere, but you have strange futuristic vehicles, a police investigation, and the case is from 1972, long before the internet and the popularity of all these reality-shifting stories on internet forums. In May of 1972, 4 girls were driving back to Southern Utah University after spending a Saturday at a rodeo. At around 10 p.m., they crossed into the Utah-Nevada state line and took a turn into Gadianton Canyon. Strangely, as they drove, the road began to change from black pavement to white cement. Thinking they were lost, they turned around but found themselves driving past unfamiliar grain fields and ponderosa pines instead of the desert that they'd been expecting. They stopped at a roadside tavern to ask for directions, but suddenly one of the girls started screaming. What they claimed to have seen were 4 egg-shaped vehicles with tricycle wheels and bright lights chasing them. Terrified, they hopped back into the car and sped through the canyon, and soon the road returned to the familiar black asphalt. They ended up crashing into a creek, which left them with 3 flat tires. They waited until morning and then hiked to Highway 56, where they flagged down a state trooper named Victoria Lindquist. The trooper took their report, and some details about the situation were pretty odd. The tire tracks the girls left stopped abruptly about 600 feet into the desert, which was strange considering they were found 2 miles away from the highway with no clear evidence of how they got there. And despite a thorough search, there was a missing right front hubcap of their Chevy that was never found.
Asturo Boone, the legend of the red and white-haired woman who lived aboard the hollow ship, is an incredibly old Japanese tale that tells of a futuristic ship made of metal and wood, equipped with crystal windows that one day made its way into the shores of Hitachi, a province in Japan. From the ship emerged an incredibly futuristic-looking woman with bright red hair with long white strands at the bottom and pale grayish skin. She appeared shocked to have ended up in the area and was downright terrified of the locals. She didn't speak any known languages, and she refused to let go of a small box she held tightly to her chest throughout the entire ordeal. Authorities entered her ship to find nothing more than 2 sheets, a small supply of water, and some strange food that resembled some kind of pastry made of meat and bread. Eventually, the woman was allowed back on the ship and sent on her way. Where she came from, or where she went, no one really knows. Perhaps she traveled to Japan from the future, or maybe even an alternate reality. And while I respect the locals respecting the woman's privacy at the time, I am curious as to what they would have found had they looked in the box she had been holding onto so tightly. Since the incident, many people have claimed to have seen the woman from another world, but we are yet to learn her true origin, what was in the box, and why on earth she was so scared.
In 1975, a man named Daniel Brinkley was struck by lightning while answering the phone. He was declared dead for 28 minutes before being revived. During those minutes, Brinkley claimed to experience what he described as leaving his body, finding himself in a dark, terrifying realm. He was then rescued by spiritual beings who took him through a tunnel of light. He claims he met beings of light who showed him his life's events in a kind of life review, seeing every moment of his life and how his actions had affected others, kind of like a more modern version of A Christmas Carol. The experience changed him profoundly, and he came back with this mission to share his story and the lessons he learned about life after death. He wrote a book about the experience that was successful enough to spawn a couple sequels and a movie in 1995.
The story of William Cantello and Hiram Maxim is either a case of a man on the run or some kind of alternate reality Freaky Friday. You see, back in the 1800s, there was a man named William Cantello. He was an eccentric inventor who had dedicated a great amount of his time developing an automatic rapid-firing weapon. When he finally completed his invention, Cantello informed his son that he was heading down to the market to sell it. Only problem is, Cantello never returned. Even stranger, no more than 20 years later, a man named Hiram Maxim appeared on the scene. Maxim had invented an automatic rapid-firing weapon, and he looked almost identical to Cantello, so much so that Cantello's children actually mistook Maxim for their father. Maxim became so distraught with constantly being compared to Cantello that he later wrote about the experience in his autobiography, claiming that there was a man impersonating him. While that might be true, or perhaps Maxim really was Cantello and had simply wanted to get away from his family or out of some debt, there is another theory out there that Cantello and Maxim are essentially the same people but from different realities, and one day they switched, causing both to spend the rest of their days often mistaken for one another and incredibly confused and irritated.
This final story comes to us from a now deleted Reddit user that goes as follows. I had something really odd happen to me last Friday, and I'm wondering if anyone else has experienced something similar. I was running errands in my town, a place I know well. Around 3 p.m. I went to a coffee shop I frequent. When I walked in, I noticed that the decor was completely different, and the staff seemed unfamiliar. The menu had changed too, with items I've never seen before. I thought maybe I was in the wrong place, but the sign outside said it was definitely the same shop. I left feeling confused and decided to drive to a nearby park. When I got there, it was totally different. New playground equipment, a different layout, and even a new entrance. After about 2 hours of wandering around, everything suddenly felt familiar again. The coffee shop was back to normal, and the park was as I remembered. I haven't been able to find any explanation for this. Could I have briefly shifted into a different reality, or is there a more logical explanation? They later went on to make a brief update on the post, by the way, stating that they'd checked with the coffee shop and park management, and that apparently no changes had been made.